9 years of loyalty disappeared in less than 10 minutes. Not because I failed my job, but because I refused to laugh while my manager humiliated our autistic new hire. His name was Evan. He avoided eye contact, took every instruction literally, and sometimes needed people to say exactly what they meant instead of hiding behind sarcasm. But he also spotted mistakes the rest of us missed, remembered every detail in a spreadsheet, and treated every assignment with quiet, unwavering focus. Different never meant incapable. My manager thought firing me would bury the truth forever. He never imagined that 4 people who had watched everything unfold had already decided they could no longer stay silent. Just organize the report the usual way. Evan looked up from his notebook, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. "I'm sorry," he said politely. "Could you explain what the usual way means? I wasn't here when the previous reports were prepared." Our manager, Richard, leaned back in his chair with a grin that always seemed to appear right before he embarrassed someone. "There it is again," he announced, loudly enough for everyone in the conference room to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, our office robot needs another software update." A few uncomfortable laughs filled the room. Someone stared at their laptop. Someone else suddenly became fascinated by their coffee cup. No one wanted to be the next target. Evan didn't laugh. He simply lowered his eyes and made another note in the small notebook he carried everywhere. His face barely changed, but I noticed his shoulders stiffen for just a second. Richard wasn't finished. "Tell me something, Evan," he said with a smirk. "Do you actually understand sarcasm, or should we print you a user manual?" More laughter. Not because the joke was funny, because people were afraid not to laugh. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't leadership. It was public humiliation disguised as entertainment. The meeting continued as if nothing had happened, but I barely heard another word. All I could think about was how easily a room full of intelligent adults had allowed one person to become the office joke. That morning changed something inside me. The strange part was that none of us had expected this when Evan first arrived. I'd worked at the company for 9 years as a project coordinator. I wasn't loud, ambitious, or interested in office politics. My performance reviews were always excellent. I rarely called in sick, met every deadline, and usually became the person new employees came to when they had questions. Helping people settle in was simply part of who I was. So on Evan's first day, I volunteered to show him around the office. He walked beside me quietly, taking in every detail: the meeting rooms, emergency exits, break room, printer stations, as though he were building a map inside his head. While I helped him set up his computer, he hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I'd like to tell you something," he said carefully. "I'm autistic. Sometimes I ask more questions than people expect because I prefer clear instructions. I also tend to interpret words literally. It helps if people say exactly what they mean." There was no embarrassment in his voice, no apology, just honesty. I smiled. "That sounds easy enough." He looked surprised. "Really?" "Of course. Half the confusion in this office comes from people pretending they're being clear when they aren't." For the first time, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just enough to show he felt understood. Over the next week, I discovered something else about him. Evan noticed things the rest of us missed. He found duplicate invoices buried inside thousands of financial records. He corrected a reporting formula that had quietly produced inaccurate numbers for months. During one project review, he calmly pointed out that the same engineer had somehow been scheduled to work in 2 different states on the same day. Everyone stared at the spreadsheet. He was right. Again. "I hope I didn't offend anyone," Evan said after the meeting. "You didn't. I've been told I can sound critical." "You weren't criticizing anyone," I replied. "You prevented a very expensive mistake." He nodded thoughtfully. "I like solving problems," he said. "Numbers are predictable. People are more complicated." I couldn't help laughing. You're going to fit in just fine. Looking back now, those words still hurt, because the only person who refused to let Evan fit in was Richard. At first, Richard's comments sounded almost harmless. Don't overthink it. Try acting a little more natural. You don't have to analyze every sentence. Then the jokes became routine. He deliberately gave Evan vague instructions, knowing he would ask for clarification. Every question became another opportunity to make him look different. See, Richard would say, this is why simple conversations take forever. Or he'd glance around the room and ask, can somebody translate that into robot language? Every laugh encouraged him. Every silence gave him permission. The cruelest part was that Evan never argued. He never raised his voice. He simply wrote everything down, completed every assignment ahead of schedule, and continued producing some of the most accurate work in the department. One afternoon I found him alone in the break room, staring out the window with a cup of untouched coffee. You okay? I asked. He thought for a moment before answering. I don't understand why asking questions makes people angry. It doesn't, I said quietly. It seems to. No, asking questions isn't the problem. He looked at me. The problem is that someone has decided to make you feel small. He looked back toward the window. I keep wondering if maybe I should stop asking. I shook my head immediately. No, Evan, don't ever stop asking when something isn't clear. That's one of the reasons you're so good at your job. He was silent for several seconds. Thank you, he finally said. Most people tell me I need to change. You don't need to become someone else to deserve respect. His expression softened. I appreciate you saying that. Walking back to my desk, I realized something that refused to leave my mind. The department didn't have an employee problem. It had a leadership problem. And if no one challenged Richard soon, Evan wouldn't be the last person he tried to break. I had no idea that my decision to speak up would soon cost me the career I'd spent 9 years building. If you think this was the worst thing Richard did, you're about to find out how far someone will go when they believe nobody will ever stand against them. The next morning, Richard acted as though nothing had happened. He greeted everyone with his usual confidence, joked about quarterly targets, and even complimented the team's productivity. If someone had walked into the office that day, they would have thought he was an inspiring manager. Then Evan walked in. Richard's smile changed almost instantly. There he is, he said loudly. Let's see how many questions we can answer before lunch. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody laughed this time. Evan quietly sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and started reviewing financial reports. Within 20 minutes, he sent a message pointing out that one vendor had been billed twice for the same service. The mistake would have cost the company several $1,000s. Richard barely looked at the report. Congratulations, he said sarcastically. The calculator works. Evan blinked. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just thought someone should know. I know, Richard replied. You always think someone should know. The room fell silent. I could almost feel everyone's discomfort hanging in the air like heavy fog. Later that afternoon, Richard gathered us for another project meeting. He projected a complicated timeline onto the screen and deliberately rushed through his explanation. When he finished, Evan raised his hand. I'm sorry, he said. 2 of these deadlines overlap. Is the testing phase supposed to begin before the client approves the revisions? Richard folded his arms. Did everyone else understand? Heads nodded around the room. See, Richard said, everyone else managed. Evan looked back at the screen. I may have misunderstood. Could you explain it again? Richard laughed. No, Evan. Sometimes in the real world you have to figure things out yourself. The meeting ended. An hour later, Richard stormed out of his office holding the same schedule. Who approved this? He demanded. No one answered. Evan quietly spoke from his desk. The overlap I mentioned earlier would delay the launch by 4 days. Richard stared at the document. He realized Evan had been right. again. But instead of admitting it, he slammed the papers onto the conference table. "Next time," he snapped. "Say it in a way normal people understand." I couldn't stay silent. "He did," I said. Every head turned toward me. Richard slowly looked up. "What was that?" I said he explained it clearly. Richard smiled, but there wasn't an ounce of warmth in it. "So you're managing my meetings now?" "No." "Then let me manage my team." "My concern isn't your meeting," I replied evenly. "It's that you're embarrassing an employee for asking reasonable questions." The office became so quiet, I could hear the air conditioner humming above us. Richard stepped closer. "If you don't like my management style," he said softly, "you're free to find another department." I held his gaze. "My management style has nothing to do with this. Respect does." For a second, I thought he might explode. Instead, he smiled again. A calm smile. The kind that usually meant someone was already planning something. He walked away without another word. That worried me more than if he had shouted. The following days only made things worse. Richard stopped giving Evan written instructions. Everything became vague. "Handle it. Make it better. You know what I mean." When Evan asked for clarification, Richard rolled his eyes dramatically or repeated the same vague sentence until everyone else felt uncomfortable. One afternoon, I found Evan reviewing the same email for the 4th time. "Everything okay?" I asked. "I'm trying to understand what he wants." I looked at the message. It contained only one sentence. "Fix the report before the client notices." "No details?" I asked. He shook his head. "I don't know which report." I sighed. "I'll help you." Together we figured out what Richard actually meant in less than 5 minutes. As we finished, Evan looked at me with genuine confusion. "Why doesn't he just write that?" I didn't have a good answer. Because the truth sounded too cruel. "He wants you to fail," I finally admitted. Evan was quiet for several seconds. "I thought if I worked hard enough, people would judge me by my work." "You should be judged by your work." "But I'm not." "No," I said quietly, "you're not." That conversation stayed with me all evening. The next morning, I opened my email and reread the company's code of conduct. The words were simple. Every employee deserves a workplace free from harassment, discrimination, and retaliation. I looked across the office. Richard was already making another joke at Evan's expense. This time, nobody laughed. Not because they suddenly found courage, because they were beginning to realize they were witnessing something that had gone far beyond a bad manager. It had become workplace bullying. I closed the handbook, opened the HR portal, and began writing a formal complaint. I knew pressing submit might change everything. I just didn't realize how quickly everything would change. If you think filing the complaint ended the nightmare, what happened over the next 2 weeks proved that the most dangerous retaliation is often the one you never see coming. Have you ever seen someone stay silent because they were afraid to speak up? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe if you want to see how this story unfolds. For the next 2 weeks, nothing happened. At least, that's what I believed. Richard became unusually polite whenever other managers were nearby. He stopped making jokes during meetings, kept conversations short, and even thanked people for their work once or twice. If someone had walked into our department during those days, they would have thought I had exaggerated everything in my complaint. But the moment the office door closed, the atmosphere changed. He rarely spoke to me directly anymore. Instead, assignments I had handled for years quietly disappeared from my calendar. Important meetings suddenly took place without me. Questions that had always come to my inbox were redirected to someone else. No one explained why. It was like watching my own job slowly vanish, one task at a time. Evan noticed it before I did. One afternoon, he stopped beside my desk. "May I ask something?" "Of course." I've noticed you're no longer invited to project planning meetings. I forced a smile. They're probably reorganizing responsibilities. He studied my expression for a second. I don't think that's true. I appreciated that he didn't pretend otherwise. Neither of us said another word. Deep down, we both knew something was changing. Then, exactly 2 weeks after I submitted my complaint, an email appeared on my screen. Meeting with Human Resources, 2 p.m. No explanation, no agenda, just a calendar invitation. The moment I saw it, my stomach tightened. I tried convincing myself it was about my complaint. Maybe HR had finished reviewing the situation. Maybe they wanted more details. Maybe someone else had come forward. By 2 o'clock, hope had become anxiety. When I entered the conference room, an HR representative was already waiting. Richard sat beside her. He didn't even try to hide the small smile on his face. "Please, have a seat," the HR representative said. Her voice sounded unusually formal. A folder rested on the table in front of her. She opened it. "After reviewing recent concerns regarding your conduct," she began, "the company has decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately." For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood. "My conduct?" She nodded. "The decision is based on repeated conflict with management, creating negativity within the team, and demonstrating a lack of respect toward leadership." I stared at her. 9 years. 9 years without a single disciplinary warning. 9 years of excellent performance reviews. And suddenly I was being described as the problem. "I filed a harassment complaint," I said calmly. "Is this related to that?" Richard answered before HR could speak. "This decision has nothing to do with your complaint." His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. "We simply need employees who contribute to a positive workplace culture." Positive. The word echoed in my head. Humiliating an autistic employee was apparently positive. Defending him was not. I looked back at the HR representative. "Have my performance reviews changed?" She hesitated. "No." "Have I received any written warnings?" "No." "Have I ever been placed on a performance improvement plan?" Again, no. I folded my hands together. So, after 9 years of positive evaluations, I'm suddenly being fired because I spoke up. The room fell silent. No one answered. That silence told me everything. The decision had already been made. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. I was handed a termination letter, asked to return my badge and laptop, and told someone would escort me to collect my personal belongings. Walking back through the office felt unreal. People looked up as I packed the framed photo from my desk, my notebook, and the coffee mug one of my coworkers had given me years earlier. Most of them looked shocked. Some looked angry. No one spoke. Richard stood outside his office watching. There was satisfaction in his expression, the look of someone convinced he had won. As I reached the elevator, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Evan. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You have nothing to apologize for." "If I hadn't been hired—" I stopped him. "No." He looked at me. "This isn't because of you." His shoulders sank. "I wish there had been something I could do." I smiled, even though it was one of the hardest smiles I'd ever forced. "You already did." He frowned. "You reminded me that some things matter more than keeping a job." The elevator doors opened. Before they closed, I looked back one last time. Several coworkers were standing near their desks. None of them smiled. None of them looked relieved. They were watching Richard, not me. And for the first time since the meeting began, I had the strange feeling that this story wasn't actually over. Richard believed he'd eliminated the only person willing to challenge him. He had no idea that 4 people inside that office had already made a decision that would change everything. The first 2 days after I lost my job felt strangely quiet. For 9 years, my mornings had started with the same routine: coffee, traffic, the elevator to the 12th floor, and a desk that had become almost a second home. Now the alarm still rang at 6:30, but there was nowhere to go. I kept replaying that meeting in my head, wondering if I could have said something differently. The answer was always the same: no. Speaking up for Evan had not been a mistake. What happened afterward was. On the third morning, my phone rang. The caller ID showed the company's main number. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. "Hello?" "Good morning," a calm voice said. "This is Melissa from Human Resources. Is this a good time to talk?" My heart immediately started racing. "Yes. There have been new developments regarding your termination." She chose her words carefully. "I can't discuss every detail over the phone, but I'd like to invite you to meet with us tomorrow." "What kind of developments?" A brief pause. "We've received additional information from several employees." Several. Not one, not two. Several. When the call ended, I stared at my phone for nearly a minute. Something had changed. The next afternoon, I returned to the same building I had walked out of only days before. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. The receptionist greeted me with an awkward smile. Two managers I barely knew nodded politely as I walked past. It was obvious people had heard something. Melissa met me outside a conference room. She looked nothing like the HR representative from my termination meeting. She looked tired. "Thank you for coming," she said. Once we sat down, she closed the door. "I owe you an explanation." She placed several folders on the table. "After your termination, 4 employees independently contacted Human Resources." I felt my pulse quicken. "They weren't interviewed together," she continued. "Each of them requested separate meetings." She opened the first folder. Their statements are remarkably consistent. One coworker described how Richard repeatedly singled Evan out during meetings. Another admitted everyone had been afraid to challenge him because he often threatened careers behind closed doors. A third provided dates, times, and detailed descriptions of incidents I hadn't even witnessed. Then Melissa opened the 4th folder. This changed everything. She turned a printed page toward me. It was a screenshot from the company's internal chat. Richard had written it several days after I submitted my complaint. "Don't worry, she won't be around much longer." Another message appeared beneath it. "Once HR calms down, I'll get rid of the problem." The problem. That was me. Melissa slid over another page. There are more. One message joked that defending Evan had been career suicide. Another said I had become too emotional to manage. Then came the message that made the room fall silent. "I'll make sure she regrets going to HR." I looked up slowly. When were these messages sent? "The day after your complaint." A chill ran through me. So he already planned to fire me. Melissa nodded. "We believe so." She reached for one final document. "Our legal department became involved this morning." She let that sentence hang in the air. "They reviewed the timeline." She placed 2 documents side by side. The first was my formal HR complaint. The second was an internal draft of my termination paperwork. The dates were impossible to ignore. The termination documents had been created the very next day after I reported the harassment. More than a week before anyone claimed concerns about my attitude. Before any investigation. Before any discussion. Before anything. I stared at the dates. "They'd already decided," Melissa answered quietly. "That's our conclusion." For the first time since losing my job, I felt something other than anger. Relief. Not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because the truth finally had evidence. Real evidence. Not opinions, not rumors. Documents. witnesses, timestamps. The kind of evidence that couldn't simply be laughed away in another meeting. Melissa folded her hands. The legal department has advised senior leadership that your termination presents significant legal risk due to the appearance of retaliation. Appearance. We both knew it was more than an appearance. But lawyers chose their words carefully. There will be another meeting tomorrow, she continued. This time, Richard won't be attending. As I walked back toward the elevator, I noticed something unusual through the glass wall overlooking our department. Richard's office was empty. 2 members of corporate security were carrying boxes out of it. Employees stood nearby pretending to work, but every pair of eyes followed those boxes. The man who had always seemed untouchable suddenly looked very alone. For the first time since all of this began, it wasn't me walking out of the building while everyone watched. It was him. But the biggest decision of my life was still waiting on the other side of tomorrow's meeting. The next morning, I walked into the executive boardroom instead of the human resources office. A long, polished table stretched across the room. 5 board members were already seated. Melissa sat quietly near the end while Richard's chair remained empty. The chairman stood as I entered. "Thank you for coming." I nodded but didn't smile. I wasn't sure I wanted to. "I understand." He waited until I sat down before speaking again. "We've completed our review of your termination." The room fell silent. "Your dismissal should never have happened." There was no corporate language, no excuses, just a simple admission. "We're formally reversing the decision." He slid a folder across the table. "Your employment record will show that your termination has been rescinded." Another document followed. "We're also offering full back pay, compensation, and immediate reinstatement to your position." For a moment, nobody spoke. 9 years. Everything I had built inside that company was sitting in front of me again. The chairman looked at me. "If you choose to return, your position is yours." I looked around the room. I remembered the conference room where Evan had been laughed at. The meetings where people stared at the table instead of speaking. The day security watched me carry my belongings to the parking lot. Finally, I closed the folder. "I appreciate the offer." The chairman nodded. "But..." I pushed the papers back across the table. "I'm not coming back." A few surprised glances crossed the room. "It isn't because of the money." I took a slow breath. "It's because I shouldn't have needed an investigation for people to believe me." No one argued. The chairman simply nodded. "I respect your decision." Melissa walked me toward the elevator after the meeting ended. Before the doors opened, she stopped. "There's one thing we've never told you." I turned toward her. "What is it?" She smiled softly. "You've thanked the 4 employees in your mind 100 times." I nodded. "They deserved it." "They did." She paused. "But they weren't the first people to come to us." I frowned. "Then who was?" "Evan." For a second, I couldn't answer. Melissa continued quietly. "The morning after you were fired, he requested a private meeting with HR. He was terrified. He kept apologizing because he thought he wasn't explaining things correctly." She smiled sadly. "But then he opened a notebook. He had written down every meeting, every date, every joke, every instruction Richard deliberately made confusing, and every time you stepped in to help." Because remembering details came naturally to him, nothing had been forgotten. His timeline matched emails, calendars, and chat records almost perfectly. "It became the foundation of the investigation," Melissa said. I stared at the floor. "I thought I protected him." "You did," she smiled. "But after you were gone, he decided it was his turn." The others told us later that once they learned Evan had spoken first, they realized they had no excuse to stay silent. I felt something tighten in my chest. All this time, I believed I had carried the weight alone. I hadn't. A week later, I met Evan for coffee. He looked nervous at first. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." I laughed softly. "Why wouldn't I?" He looked down at his cup. I thought I was the one who needed protecting. I smiled. So did I. He looked up. I just didn't want what happened to you to become meaningless. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I reached across the table. Sometimes, I said, people save each other. For the first time since we'd met, Evan smiled without looking away. And somehow, that felt like the real ending to the story.